Hey everyone, in this video I want to walk through how we can authenticate from our GitHub Actions to Azure Active Directory. Whenever we have one service wanting to deploy to another service, well, it has to be able to authenticate as some identity, and then that identity after that authentication then can be authorized to have certain roles and certain permissions. So in this example, I'm focused on GitHub Actions talking to Azure AD, but this same concept of using OIDC, that OpenID Connect, applies to many other services. It applies to GitHub Actions talking to other cloud services like AWS as well. I'm going to focus on using GitHub and Azure AD. Now in the past, if I thought about, well, I had some service, for example, let's say it was GitHub, and that service, I guess I should draw its little cat icon, although I really can't draw its icon very well. But if we had GitHub, and if it wanted to go and use another service, for example, let's say Azure AD, well, it has to be able to authenticate. It has to be able to prove it is who it says it is. And the way it did that in the past is we would have a service principal, for example, an app registration, and a secret. So we'd have to store that secret over there on GitHub, and it would use that as part of the authentication. And then that credential would be given roles on, for example, an Azure subscription, so we could then go and deploy things. But a more secure way is to do away with having to store that secret on the GitHub side and instead use OpenID Connect, OIDC, where I can get a token issued through this identity provider, which can then be exchanged for an Azure AD token by the flow running, which then can have roles granted to Azure resources. So this is the whole point. And so when I talk about OIDC, there's a relationship established in this case between Azure AD and GitHub. That's going to allow Azure AD to be able to ensure these identity tokens created by GitHub really did come from GitHub, and then we'll exchange them for an access token that issued by Azure AD that can then, hey, give me access to Azure AD trusting resources. Now, when I talk about OpenID Connect, so if we think about OIDC for a second, OpenID Connect is all about authentication. So it's proving, hey, I am who I say I am. Now this actually sits on top of OAuth 2.0. Now OAuth is all about authorization. And we see this all of the time. If I'm using Facebook, it says, hey, I want permission to access your Apple photographs, for example. And I give consent to say, well, you, Facebook client, is allowed to act on my behalf to access resources I own, i.e. my photos, but only my photos and nothing else. So this is using OAuth 2 to give authorization to the Facebook client that can act on my behalf. So it's a delegated set of permissions so it can access that resource I own. Now with authorization OAuth 2, there's not a strict format. So it's really just some string, but often it will use a JSON web token, which is often said JOT. Now with the OIDC, OpenID Connect, which sits on top of OAuth 2, it always uses that JSON web token, a JOT. And it's made up of a couple of components. So I can think about, well, there's always a header. And then inside it, it's going to have claims. This is the body of that token. And this is going to have various pieces of information like the issuer, which initially will be GitHub. The subject, well, the particular workflow that's running as a GitHub Actions. What is the audience? Well, the audience is going to be Azure AD token exchange. And then it has a signature. And the signature is very important because it's going to prove, hey, it was coming from GitHub and it's not been tampered with, because that signature is a digest of all of the header and the claims, and then it's signed, encrypted with its, for example, a private key, so no one could tamper with the content of it. So this is all about using these JOT tokens. It's just important to understand, hey, we're talking about OpenID Connect here. It's about authentication. So it's actually going to give me an identity token that says, hey, yes, I authenticated as this particular identity. It's a proof of authentication. It's not around authorization, which is, hey, some consent to perform some task or other. So that's really a key point in what we're going to do. So what I want to do here is, well, hey, I've got a GitHub action running, some workflow that I want to perform some action against, let's say an Azure subscription. I want to deploy some resources. So the first thing we have to do is, well, it's going to have a token given by GitHub. Now, within GitHub, I have a particular repository. So let's say I have a certain repo, whatever that name may be. And inside this repo, well, I have a workflow. So I have my workflow that does various different things. It could deploy, it might be triggered off something else, but I have this workflow that wants to go and talk to Azure. Now, when I'm running as this workflow, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to get a token from GitHub. So there's going to be a token service. So let's think about here. GitHub is operating a token, an identity provider. It's running this token service. And as part of my workflow, this token service is going to issue me a token. Now, this token is an identity token using OpenID Connect. So it's that JSON web token format, and it's going to have a number of components to it. Now, first, there's going to be a certain issuer. So there's going to be an issuer, and the issuer is this token dot actions, and there's a whole set of things about it. We can actually quickly go and look at one of the tokens that it generates. So if I was to go and just look super quickly at one of these, here we go. So over here, we can see the issuer is this token.actions.githubusercontent.com. So that's the issuer of this. We can also see there is an audience, which is this Azure AD token exchange. And I can also see this subject, and this is a super important part. So on this subject, this is details about, well, what is the organization, John the Brit, what is the repo, DevOps MC, and then there's some entity. In this case, it's a particular environment, and that environment is test. But this can absolutely vary. So the issuer is that, hey, the token service of GitHub. But then we have this subject, and this has to be exact. Now, depending on your workflow and what it's targeting, you're going to have different elements. It's always going to be this repo, and then it's the org, the repo name. But then it's going to depend. It's going to depend on, well, what is the entity? Is it a tag? Is it a branch? Is it an environment? Is it a pull request? So there's going to be some entity, and then depending on what entity I set, there's going to be some value. And I have to be very precise with that. Because if I get it wrong, it will fail when I take this identity token and give it to Azure AD. It says, no, I've been configured with a certain subject I'm expecting. This does not match. And if we go and look over here, so this was one that failed. And we can see, because my subject was sending, hey, environment test, it could find no federated identity record. And this was because I set up Azure AD incorrectly. I did not set it up for the environment. Once I then set up Azure AD correctly, and we run it again, well, then we see the subject claim just worked. It found a match, and I successfully could authenticate. We can see again that issuer, the claim. So it's super important I understand exactly which one I'm using. And we can see this because if I go and look, for example, at my particular environment, Well, firstly, an important point here is when I'm using this, we have these permissions on the tokens. So I've got this ID token, right, and the contents I can read. But then when I'm doing this deployment, I am targeting an environment, and I'm targeting the environment test. So that means the entity that I'm focused on is an environment. Now, it doesn't have to be the case. If we look at the documentation, this is a content of all the different things that could be in the token. It does give examples. So it gives examples of depending on what type of thing. So if I'm just doing a pull request, then it would be, hey, the repo pull request. If I was using a branch, then it would be referencing the branch. If I was using, it's got different examples here. So environment, I can see up here, and I can do tags as well. So depending on what I'm targeting in my environment, I need to be very specific because that's what I'm going to be matching when I go and set up the Azure AD side. Because again, I have to go and exchange this. What's basically going to happen behind the scenes is in Azure AD, what I'm going to set up is an application registration. And as part of this application registration, I'm going to set up a federated credential that's going to say, hey, what is the entity value I'm expecting that has to match for me to give it a token representing this application? So this has to be very specific because this is what I have to match in my configuration on the Azure AD side. So it's going to issue me a token. It's also going to have an audience. The audience is who is expected to be given this identity token. So the audience is the Azure AD token exchange. Because GitHub is creating this token so I can go and give it to Azure AD to go and give me a token. So that's what happens. It's generating me this token. So now my workflow has a token. It has this identity token. So this is an identity token. And it's going to give it to Azure AD. Azure AD is then going to create an access token for this application. Actually, just redraw that arrow a little bit. It's going to give it to my workflow. And then the workflow, now it has this access token generated by Azure AD, can go and present it back to Azure AD, and that can be authorized for other things. For example, Azure, and maybe there's a particular, for example, subscription. There's a subscription ID. Maybe it has some role for a particular subscription. And that's the flow. This is the whole point. So nowhere in here am I having to store a secret somewhere. By the nature of this being a particular workflow targeting a particular tag or branch or environment or pull request, the GitHub token service gives it a token that represents what it's targeting. And then I configure my app registration over here to just do all of that for me. And all of this just happens for me by, if I go and look over here, if I go back and actually look at my workflow, I can see all of this happens with this Azure login. Now, I still need a few bits of information, but there's no secret here in terms of a password. I'm still storing the client ID, the tenant ID, and the sub ID as values in GitHub, and they're called secrets, but it's not a password. So I need to know the client ID, the tenant ID, and the subscription ID. And I have all of these things because they're all just part of the environment. But all of this is just done as part of the environment. And the great thing is this is documented for you. And this is in the description below, but it walks through the exact steps of adding the federated credentials, the values you need, creating the GitHub secrets, setting up the login. It's step by step for you. But I thought what we could do is we could quickly walk through just what are some of those key points. So I guess we could actually start, if I look at, you have to create an app registration. So I created an app registration GitHub DevOps. So I'm in my Azure AD app registrations, and then I created my GitHub DevOps. And what we're looking for here is certificates and secrets, but this time I added, rather than adding a client secret, I added a federated credential. And in that federated credential, this is where you have to be super specific. So you'll notice here, my organization name, my repo name, and then I'm targeting an environment. So then the value is the name of the environment. But I also have options, depending on what I'm doing, to have environment, branch, pull request, or tag. But I have to be specific. So you need to make sure you go through it. It's even showing me this is what I'm going to expect as the subject from the token, which is what we see when it was successful. That is the subject claim. So that now matches on what I've configured for that app registration. So it's going to work. Fantastic. So if I think just totally quickly, so what I'm doing here is I've got the app registration. And on the app registration, what I have to do is, there's obviously attributes. So this app registration, what it has, a client ID, an application ID. So the app registration just natively has an app ID. That's just part of it. Then what I'm adding here is I want to add a federated credential to that configuration. So I have to tell it the org, the repo, what entity type, environment, tag, branch, pull request, and then whatever the value is. And again, this all has to match that. That's the key point. And this is going to depend on what I'm doing in my workflow. Because in my workflow, as part of this, I specify what am I targeting. So that entity type, I'm putting in here. And then remember, to actually trigger all this off, I do an Azure login. And that's what makes it go and get this token, and then go and give that token to Azure AD to exchange those things. So with these details, the app ID is just part of the app registration. My Azure AD tenant has a tenant ID. And then that app registration, I give a role to certain subscriptions, the subscription I want to deploy to. And that subscription has a subscription ID. So these three details I need configured over in the GitHub. So in my repo, I'll actually go and set up secrets for that tenant ID, the app ID, and the subscription ID. Now these could just be general repo secrets. They might be per environment if I was targeting that. There's different ways to actually configure this. But if I jump back over and look, what we can absolutely see is if I look at my file here, we can see, yes, it's accessing these three secrets. And there's nothing special here. If I just go to my settings and I go and look at my secrets and variables for my actions, I just created them at the repo level. So hey, the client ID, the subscription ID, and the tenant ID. And those three values are very easily accessible. When I'm looking at my app registration in the overview page, it shows you your client ID, and it even conveniently shows you your tenant ID. So those are two of the values I need. And then obviously for your subscription, well, that's just shown in the overview page. It would show you your subscription ID. And then that app registration, so mine is called GitHub DevOps, I granted it at this subscription a role. So I granted GitHub DevOps contributor role. Now, I didn't have to do it necessarily at the subscription. It could have been a resource group. I could have made that more specific. But now what happens is when that workflow runs, it just has permissions and it can go through and actually complete that deployment. And that's it. And there's really nothing else to it. It sounds more complicated than it really is. What it breaks down to is I create an app registration. I add a federated credential for GitHub. I just need to know, hey, what's the org name, the repo name? What am I targeting? Branch, tag, pull request environment, what the value is. I populate those things in. I then give that app registration a role on whatever the target is. And then I have to feed in the sub ID, the app ID, and the tenant ID as part of that Azure login for it to be able to do that OpenID connect. Basically token swap. Hey, I'm going to give you an identity token, give me an access token I can then use to go and deploy things to Azure. So that's it. That's how it works. I'm no longer having to store a password, a secret as part of GitHub. I just have these basic values here. And again, I'm talking about GitHub over here, talking to Azure AD, but exactly the same thing works for GitHub to AWS. We're starting to see this used in other things like Kubernetes, going and getting tokens for pods to other services via Azure AD. This OpenID Connect and getting this identity token that proves, hey, I'm this certain identity, give me a token for something else, is becoming very, very popular. It removes the need to have to worry about maintaining password secrets in services. So that was it. I hope that makes sense. Again, the documentation is step by step. You can just follow it through. I just wanted to explain a little bit about what's going on. Till next video, take care.